I want to start off by saying that I'm delighted to be here from my bunker in the library at the University of Huddersfield, my own university. And I wanted to start off by thanking the University of Leeds and Special Collections at the Brotherton Library for giving me the opportunity to curate this exhibition about the Cottingley Fairies. I contacted the Special Collections in May 2018 originally to suggest that we might put on an exhibition to mark the centenary of the publication of the Cottingley Fairies photographs. And my own interest in it grew out of my academic research and work as a scholar of Victorian and Edwardian literature, as a scholar of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and also as a great fan of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And I'd been interested for a while in Arthur Conan Doyle's work and involvement with the spiritualist movements, particularly in the later part of his career. And it came to my attention that the Cottingley Fairies archive was at the Special Collections at the University of Leeds. And I began to be interested in it. Now, the Cottingley Fairies was something that I knew about vaguely. It's something that I'd heard about as a child. But I think, coming at it from the point of view of being a fan of Sherlock Holmes, I had mixed feelings about it. I think rather like, sorry, I'm just having an issue advancing my slides. There we go. Rather like the creator of this cartoon for Punch magazine, which was one of the early responses to the Cottingley Fairies photographs, which shows Sherlock Holmes shackled to Arthur Conan Doyle with his head in the clouds. And there's a little verse that goes with it that says, "Your own creation, that great sleuth, who spent his life chasing truth. How does he view your latest defiance, O Arthur, of the laws of science?" And I thought that view of the Cottingley Fairies and of Arthur Conan Doyle as having this late defiance of the laws of science didn't seem quite right to me. It was partly because I was aware that Conan Doyle had been interested in the occult and in spiritualism since around the time that he first started writing the Sherlock Holmes stories. So this wasn't a late defiance. And I began to wonder what exactly was going on with the Cottingley Fairies story. Most biographers and critics writing about this episode in Conan Doyle's life found themselves at something of a loss, I think, to account for why Conan Doyle endorsed these fairy photographs. Clearly, as this cartoon shows, there wasn't widespread acceptance of them necessarily. There was a fairly wide sense that Conan Doyle, was endorsing something which didn't really stack up. Douglas Kerr, one of Conan Doyle's biographers, wrote simply that everyone knows Conan Doyle made a fool of himself over the case of the Cottingley Fairies. But I wanted to understand better because I wasn't convinced that that's all there was really to it. And when I visited the archive and started to piece the story together, it began to seem to me much more interesting than that. The key to the whole thing seemed to me to be about the matter of deception. Here was, after all, the world's longest running hoax. How would it come about and why? Usually, when there's a hoax, there's some smart aleck somewhere in the wings desperate to show off how clever he is, but not here. This hoax ran for over 60 years before finally the girls, by this time old ladies, who'd taken the photographs, admitted to what they'd done and how they'd done it. So there was no sense of showboating and showing off here, and I found that intriguing. And the reason I think that it came about as it did is that it was, I guess, what I would call an accidental conspiracy. There's a chain of minor deceptions involving various people that ultimately combined to create something that was much bigger than the sum of its parts. Was it just a matter of chance? Well, yes and no. Much of it depended on circumstances and things could easily have gone otherwise. But I think we can also see a dynamic at work in this case that propels it forward. It's the same kind of thing that we see in the conspiracy theories and social media bubbles of our own times. People with open minds begin to close them when other people engage in polemical debates, for example. And people's tentative opinions harden into certainties when the only people they speak to are other people with the same opinions. And I think to a large extent, that's what happened with the Cottingley Fairies. So what follows in this presentation and this talk is a showcase of some of the highlights of the exhibition and my attempt to piece together a narrative that does justice to the different layers of the story of Francis Griffiths and Elsie Wright's stories, the role of Edward Gardner, the rationalist adversaries that Conan Doyle saw as the people that he had to defeat in debate, and his spiritualist allies that egged him on, and that raised the stakes from what began as a childish prank into something that was a global cause célèbre. So the story, I think, that I want to tell starts actually quite a way back. It starts in 1887. And I mentioned earlier on that Conan Doyle's interest in spiritualism and the occult dates back to around about the same time that he started writing the Conan Doyle stories. The first Conan Doyle story he published, the first Sherlock Holmes story he published, A Study in Scarlet, was published in December of 1887. The same year that Conan Doyle wrote a letter to Light magazine, which was a journal of psychical, occult and mystical interests, into writing a letter in which he reported on a seance he'd attended and gave a positive endorsement of it. He seemed to think that there was something in it. So Conan Doyle's earliest Sherlock Holmes stories coincide with the beginnings of his interest in the occult. So this idea that it's a sort of a late defiance of the laws of science doesn't really stack up to scrutiny. So 1887 is a key starting point, but actually A Study in Scarlet didn't attract a very great deal of attention to begin with, and nor did his subsequent novel, The Sign of the Four. It wasn't until he began his association with the Strand magazine in 1891 that Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes really started to take off and become public celebrities and major elements in popular culture. The Strand magazine was newly launched in 1891 in January of that year, and Conan Doyle sent in a selection of short stories, and it was the short stories that really seemed to capture the public imagination rather than the novels that he wrote at first. But in any case, they became hugely popular very, very quickly, and so Conan Doyle's success, Sherlock Holmes' success, and the Strand magazine's success were all deeply intertwined with each other. Fast forward again to 1901. Conan Doyle had tired of writing the Sherlock Holmes stories after a couple of years and killed Sherlock Holmes off in the December 1893 issue of the Strand magazine in the final problem, in which Sherlock Holmes grapples with Professor Moriarty and they fall to their death at the Reichenbach Falls. But Doyle had been under pressure ever since to try to find a way of bringing Sherlock Holmes back. Such was the popularity of the character. And so in 1901, he was finally persuaded to bring Sherlock Holmes back in a new story, a novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles, which was serialized in the Strand magazine once more. This was also, incidentally, the year that Elsie Wright was born. Elsie was a girl who would grow up to be artistic, mischievous, and independent-minded. There is, of course, no connection between them at this point in 1901. What I'm trying to do at the moment is just sort of lay out some of the strands that converge when we get to 1917, which is the next point, fast forwarding to this year. 1917 was the year that Francis Griffiths, Elsie Wright's cousin, returned to England from Cape Colony in South Africa, where she had grown up. Her family had emigrated there, mainly to do with her mother's health. But in 1917, her father, who was in the Royal Artillery, was recalled to join the Western Front, and so they travelled back to England for him to join the war, and for Frances and her mother to live with Polly Wright, Elsie Wright's mother, and her husband Arthur in Cottingley in West Yorkshire. 1917 was also the year in which Arthur Conan Doyle publicly converted to spiritualism. So he'd been interested in spiritualism and had been largely persuaded by it since 1887. His attitude had varied. He'd kind of fluctuated somewhat in his enthusiasm for it and in his belief in it. But by 1917, he decided that he was going to publicly convert to spiritualism, and that was going to be the main thing that he would devote his life to thereafter, and his resources. So Elsie arrived in England as somebody who'd grown up in South Africa. She left behind the country in drought and arrived in England where it was cold and there was snow, and moving into this small 2-up 2-down house that they were sharing with another family. So it was a disorienting and strange experience for her. They travelled back on a ship called the Galway Castle, and Frances was bought a book, Princess Mary's Gift Book, in which she wrote in her later memoir that her favourite piece within this was a piece by Rudyard Kipling called Big Steamers, which also featured illustrations of ships, not unlike the one that she had travelled back from Cape Colony to England on. And Princess Mary's Gift Book is a crucial part of this story because it contained writings by many of the leading authors and illustrations by many of the leading artists of the day. It was a fundraising publication. It included a story, incidentally, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, but it also included this poem, A Spell for a Fairy. And it wasn't the poem so much as the illustrations by Claude Shepperson that have a significant role to play in this story, as we'll see shortly. But in 1917, Frances arrived in Cottingley. She was 9 years old and Elsie was 16 years old in 1917. They shared a bedroom and Elsie felt for Frances and befriended her. Elsie, of course, arrived with a South African accent. There's a lot of factors involved here that I guess mean that Frances was likely to feel relatively out on a limb, slightly alienated and so forth. And it was a difficult situation with two families living very close together in such a small house. And Elsie took Frances under her wing and looked after her and befriended her. They lived at number 31 Main Street in Cottingley. And as is apparent from the range of photographs that we've got in the exhibition, just of daily life and family groups and friends and so forth, photography was a significant part of daily life for the family in Cottingley. This was largely due to the fact that Elsie Wright's father, Arthur, was a keen amateur photographer. He'd bought this Butcher's and Sons quarter-plate Midge camera and set up a darkroom in the former pantry of the house, and so was taking photographs and developing them on a regular basis. And so their life in 1917, in the summer of 1917, is quite well documented. Frances and Elsie spent quite a lot of time down at the beck, which was at the bottom of the garden behind the houses on Main Street, as is illustrated in this map, which Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had drawn up for his publication, the Coming of the Fairies, which tells the story of the Cottingley Fairies. And they spent many hours having picnics, floating rafts down the summer, and generally having a good time. And then one day, Frances had been playing down by the beck on her own, and she came back with wet shoes. Now, as I said, the pressure that they were living under was quite severe. The worry of a husband fighting in the war on the Western Front was part of it. In fact, in a memoir, Frances reports that her mother's hair fell out, such was the stress of the situation. But in any case, when Frances came back one day with wet shoes, her mother was exasperated and said, "I don't know what I'm going to do with you. You've never been disobedient before, and there's nothing up that old beck anyway. Polly and I have been up there to see what attracts you, but there's nothing." And Frances replied that she did what she'd never done before. She answered her back yelling, "There is. I go up to see the fairies." So this is the starting point of the fairy story. In her memoir, Frances claims that she did actually see little men. They weren't like the fairies in the photographs. They looked more like troops. She describes them as parading around and wondering whether they had similar experiences to her father. But in any case, this was the story that she told her mother, that she went to the beck to see the fairies. Her mother and her aunts and uncle received the story in the way that you would imagine that they would. They were skeptical, they laughed, they thought it was silly. They were kind of cross that she was lying as well. But Elsie felt sorry for Frances, and so she backed her up and she said that she also saw fairies down at the beck. And you can imagine that for a 16-year-old to say this, even more than for a 9-year-old to say this, was a subject that could only attract ridicule and mockery. And so this went on for several days. The girls stuck to their guns and stuck to their story and said that they insisted they did see fairies. Frances, at least according to a memoir, genuinely claims that she saw something. Elsie never really claimed to have seen something. She was just, you know, in it for the mischief and the belligerence, it would seem. But in any case, as the mockery went on for several days, Elsie began to get irritated by it and decided that she wanted some revenge. So she came up with a plan and she swore Frances to secrecy. And the plan was that they would borrow her father's camera and that they would mock up some fairies, take a photograph and then bring it back to the parents as proof. And this is where Princess Mary's gift book comes in. The illustrations by Claude Shepperson for the poem Song for a Fairy were the basis for Elsie's fairies. She copied them, she added wings, she mounted them on hat pins, and then they took them down the beck, worked them into the earth and posed Frances behind them to take the photograph. Arthur Wright was reluctant to lend his camera. He'd never lent it before. Elsie had never taken a photograph before, and he wasn't at all keen on the idea. But given the arguments, the mockery and so forth that had been going on, Polly Wright and Annie Griffiths, the girls' mothers, egged on Arthur Wright and said, come on, lend them the camera, let's see what happens. And so he did. He relented. He lent them the camera. He gave them one photographic plate and sent them off to do it. They went off with the pre-prepared fairies that Elsie had already made. And from the house at 31 Main Street, they went down the beck towards where there's a waterfall, posed the fairies and took the picture. And they came back in about half an hour's time with the picture and asked Arthur Wright to develop it immediately. And to his shock and surprise, the picture emerged of Frances and the fairies. Now, I think this is the first really, well, there's lots of remarkable things about this, but I think this is the first really remarkable thing about this. I mocked up some fairies in the same way that Elsie did over the summer and put them on pins and put them in the riverbank and took a picture, and it didn't look like that. I think one of the first remarkable things about this is the incredible natural aptitude that that Elsie had as a photographer and as an artist. And this is a beautifully composed picture. And perhaps the story wouldn't quite have taken off in the way that it did if this hadn't been quite the picture that it is. But it's an amazing image, I think you'll agree. When they brought the picture back, the adults were sort of baffled by what they saw. They couldn't explain it, but at the same time, they didn't believe it either. And so the mockery continued and the arguments and the jokes and all the rest of it. And so after a while, because the girls were determined to stick to their story, they decided that they would double down and take another photograph. So they asked to borrow the camera again and took a second photograph, this time of Elsie posing with the figure of a goblin. So when they brought this back, the adults were once again baffled. Now they had a set of two that they couldn't explain and that they didn't believe either. They pressured the girls to confess, to explain what they'd done, but the girls were adamant that they saw fairies and that they'd photographed real fairies, and that was all there was to it. And so that was the situation, and that was how it was left. And things didn't really move on until another 3 years' time. So in 1920, the two girls' mothers, Polly Wright and Annie Griffiths, went to the Bradford Theosophical Society to hear a lecture about fairy life. And after the lecture, they were overheard speaking about these photographs that that the girls had taken 3 years previously of fairies. The people at the Theosophical Institute were very interested to see the photographs, and so they asked to get copies and were distributing them when they came to the attention of Edward Gardner, who was the the General Secretary of the Theosophical Society in England, who lectured on the subject of fairy life and was considered an expert. Gardner got in touch with the family. He asked for copies of the photographs. He then asked to borrow the negatives because the initial prints were of a fairly poor quality and the negatives were underexposed. And so he had the negatives worked on, improved. He had lantern slides made. He had them colorized and generally gussied up, and then began giving lectures with these the two photographs as illustrations for his lectures on fairy life at the Theosophical Institute at the Mortimer Hall in London. From there, word spread to the editor of Light magazine, that magazine that Conan Doyle had published his letter in 1887. And David Gow, the editor, who knew Conan Doyle and who knew that he was interested in spirit photography, so photography of supernatural figures appearing next to mortal humans. But he also knew that he was writing an article on fairies for the Strand magazine, and so he recommended that Conan Doyle got in touch with Edward Gardner, which is what he did. Dear Sir, I'm very greatly interested in the fairy photographs, which really should be epoch-making if we can entirely clear up the circumstances. That phrase epoch-making comes back later on. It's interesting because it appears as a subtitle in the article that Conan Doyle eventually published. So already on the first letter, before he's even seen the photographs, he's already got a sense that this is something which is going to be hugely significant for him. Conan Doyle also wrote to Elsie Wright's father, to Mr. Wright, saying that he was very interested in the photographs which your little girl took, and they're certainly amazing. He's writing an article for the Strand, and so he wants to get permission to use the photographs. So at this point, circumstances have shifted somewhat, and you can appreciate the parents' dilemma. Having for 3 years laughed at these photographs, ridiculed them, and assumed that there was some kind of prank. Now suddenly Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's writing letters to you directly, asking for permission to publish them and taking them seriously. And I think this also partly plays into the psychology of what happens next, because Elsie gives her permission for the photographs to be published in a magazine article in the Strand magazine that is endorsing them effectively as authentication of the existence of fairies. Part of what her thought process was involved in, I think, was to get some revenge on her father. She was enjoying laughing at her father. In one of the letters, she laughingly reports on how amusing it would be for her father to finally believe in the fairy photographs. Conan Doyle's involvement in the photographs and his interest in them was partly to do with his existing role as an advocate of spiritualism. So from his conversion in 1917, Conan Doyle had taken it upon himself to be the leading advocate for spiritualism, the leading proponent. He wrote in his the letter to Gardner, he mentioned that he was about to go on a lecture tour of Australia promoting spiritualism. So he was trying to be the leading global proponent of spiritualism in general. And that meant that he was involved in a number of kind of political battles as much as anything else on a number of fronts. One of them was an antagonistic relationship with the Rationalist Press Association, as represented by Joseph McCabe and Edward Clodd, who were deeply opposed to spiritualism, who saw it as essentially fraud that was perpetrated on the gullible and exploiting people's grief, particularly those who'd lost loved ones in the Great War. And so they were quite vociferous in their opposition and their polemical campaigns against spiritualism. There were also others in the scientific establishment who were seeking to have spirit mediums prosecuted under the vagrancy laws and so forth. So it was quite a hostile environment. There was also some controversy between Conan Doyle and the Society for Psychical Research, which was the main body that was interested in supernatural matters or claims towards the supernatural and investigating them. But Conan Doyle saw the Society for Psychical Research as mainly dominated by skeptics, whereas he thought that you should be open-minded as he saw it. And so he set himself up both in opposition to the people like Edward Clodd, but also in opposition to the Society for Psychical Research. He wanted to displace it and install himself as a leading authority on all matters to do with the supernatural. So when Conan Doyle received the copies of the photographs, he sent them to Sir Oliver Lodge, who was both a leading scientist, but also a member of the Society for Psychical Research, who also believed in spiritualism. In his letter to Edward Gardner, he reports on what Oliver Lodge's comments about the photographs were, and he was essentially wary, I think it's fair to say. And Conan Doyle comments that Lodge's remarks about the photographs are worth taking in mind, but he says that he felt that we are both sufficiently on our guard already. So Conan Doyle is assuming that he has the wherewithal, the skepticism, the necessary critical judgment to determine whether or not these photographs are genuine or not. And in fact, he was instrumental in setting up another body which sought to rival the Society for Psychical Research in the investigation of supernormal pictures, the Society for the Study of Supernormal Pictures, which investigated spirit photography and also things like photographs of fairies. We've got, as you can see, the rules for the Society for the Study of Supernormal Pictures. We have a copy of this typed and obviously rather badly water damaged. A number of the items in the Cottingley Fairies archive were quite badly water damaged, and some of the conservation work that's been going on has been performing a very valuable service to restore these documents and preserve them for the future. But one of the consequences of Conan Doyle moving outside of the Society for Psychical Research and working within this this alternative grouping was that the people that he was speaking to all by definition signed up as an article of faith that they believed in such a thing as supernormal pictures. They believed it was possible to photograph ghosts and spirits and fairies and elves and so forth. And so that meant that when Conan Doyle turned to others to ask their opinion, he was operating within these networks of those who were already fully subscribed to the idea of fairies and spirits and so forth. So this letter to Gardner reports on the feedback he's had from someone called Kenneth Stiles, who is, he says, a fairy authority. Kenneth Stiles, he reports, was suspicious of the photographs, and he claims that at least one of them is a most patent fraud. Now, his letter, Kenneth Stiles goes into all kinds of technical detail about F numbers and exposure times and all the rest of it. So it's on the one hand, it's very technical and detailed, but on the other hand, as he says here, he's relying on Aphelius's assistance. Aphelius is his spirit guide. So his judgment on the photographs is a combination of technical expertise in photography and also the messages that come through when he was in a spirit trance state. So Conan Doyle's networks in evaluating this stuff are ones which are essentially confirming biases. They are operating on certain assumptions, and so they don't look to question, but largely look to confirm. And we can see that later on in the same letter, where Conan Doyle talks about the goblin showing a distinct umbilicus, which is against any doll theory. So one of the theories that was put forward about the second of the photographs that featuring Elsie and the goblin was that it was a doll that was propped up, and he points out that you can see an umbilicus in the photograph. Francis Griffiths later, when they finally admitted the hoax, said that what you could see was the pin sticking through the paper, the hat pin that they put through the figure in order to pin it in the ground, and that was what Conan Doyle had seen as an umbilicus. So there's a lack of skepticism, there's a willingness to see what he wants to see. At the same time, Conan Doyle's authority as somebody who spoke on spiritual matters was largely derived from his reputation as the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes, of course, being renowned primarily as this detective who was very rational and scientific and objective and materialistic. In his publication, The Vital Message, it's promoted as being by the author of The New Revelation, which was the book in which Conan Doyle first articulated his conversion to spiritualism, but also The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So Holmes is there as a sort of an authority in the background that validates Conan Doyle's own credentials as somebody who is able to make valid judgments, who's able to evaluate evidence and so forth. And this, it turned out, was a bit of a double-edged sword. It was certainly one of the reasons why people within the Society for Psychical Research, such as J. Arthur Hill, were keen to recruit Conan Doyle, were keen to have his involvement, because they felt that he would carry a lot of weight in a courtroom, for example, if they were fighting the conviction of a spirit medium. And also that he would hopefully bring some particular kind of intellectual acumen to the whole business. But there was a downside to this. And as he says, he's talking about Arthur Wright, the father of Elsie Wright, and he says the father is a materialist of sorts, and this is in the letter to Conan Doyle, and it would be pie for the Rationalist Press Association, Ed Clodd, Ray Lancaster and co, if they get Sherlock Holmes's creator to take seriously a thing which is a hoax. They will say, moreover, that if you can be taken in, we weaker brethren, who are not as versed in criminology, need not be considered when we trot out our own evidence. So Conan Doyle is both an asset and a threat in this context. And in the exhibition, we've got these letters, but we've also got items from another archive bit of the papers belonging to Edward Clodd, which is also in the special collections. And if you look at Clodd's writings, you see this sort of furious scrawling in the margins of his books about Conan Doyle. He's excerpted a review from the Times literary supplement that's stuffed into the page of one of his books, talking about how the late Frank Podmore, a man from the Society for Psychical Research, took Conan Doyle to some seances, thinking that his ingenuity shown in his detective stories would make him a competent judge, but he found that the medium easily fooled Conan Doyle. Elsewhere, he, in these books, which are his personal copies, are sort of stuffed with excerpts from reviews that are critical of Conan Doyle, his own comments, and letters from Conan Doyle to him, in which he highlights the shortcomings in Conan Doyle's scientific thinking, including this quotation here where he approvingly quotes a critic who said of Conan Doyle that he reveals an extraordinary inability to grasp the principles of scientific investigation. So Hill's judgment wasn't far off in terms of the animosity that Clodd had towards Conan Doyle. And one of the things that it indicates is that the Cottingley Fairies had become the key battleground of ideas in the polemics between rationalists and spiritualists. So one of the reasons why it became so significant for Conan Doyle and more generally is because everything that Conan Doyle represented in terms of the authority with which he spoke as a creator of Sherlock Holmes, but also as a foremost proponent of spiritualism, became concentrated and focused on these fairy pictures from Cottingley. So when Conan Doyle asked Gardner to provide his report, he'd done this by this point from Australia because, as mentioned earlier, Conan Doyle was about to embark on a lecture tour of Australia. And so he asked Gardner to act as a liaison between himself and the family, to do all the legwork in terms of the investigation of the photographs, to seek expert advice and evaluations, and ask Gardner to compile a report, which Gardner did, and which is featured in the Strand magazine article. It's presented as objective, and in particular the information about the context in which the photographs were taken, the F numbers, the lighting conditions, the distance and so forth between the camera and the subject were all listed in this very objective and seemingly empirical way. But at the same time, there are some features of Gardner's reports to Conan Doyle about how we'd been handling it, which also might raise an eyebrow. One of them is that he says in point 1 here, I have definite leave and permission to act as regards the photographs as best as he sees fit. So he had attained or obtained approval from the family to copyright the photographs to himself for publication in the Strand magazine and to deal with them in any way he wished. The main thing that they wanted was anonymity for the girls, because they didn't want them to be the subject of any sort of prurient inquiries and generally unwelcome publicity. He also notes that the evaluations that he'd requested from Kodak and from Illingworth were inconclusive. They were, as he says, unwilling to testify as to the authenticity of the photographs. But he does have another photographer, a photographic expert called Harold Snelling, who was willing to sign and allow to be published anything like the following. So Gardner has prepared a statement that offers an authentication of the pictures and says that they're not faked, that they're not been produced in a studio, that there's no evidence of kind of fraud or fakery of any kind, that they're not touched up, and notes that Snelling has had 30 years of experience of practical photography, including all kinds of made-up studies. So he's an expert in photographic effects and photographic manipulation and so forth, seemingly an ideal person to see whether these were faked photographs, as indeed he was. But Snelling also had another job, and that job was to improve the photographs for Gardner's lecture slides. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest here. And one of the things that is apparent when you look at the negatives which we have in the collection in the Brotherton Library is that this is not in fact an untouched photograph. It is, as the image on the right shows, it's one that's been already abraded to brighten the face. But as it turns out, this isn't even the original negative that was taken in the camera. This is a 4th generation copy that is the end product of Snelling's improvement process. You can just about make out round Francis's head there's some sort of swirly marks from that process of abrading and rubbing down, but it seems that Snelling's work was more involved than that. He removed some foliage. He also enhanced the detail on the fairy's wings and generally improved the quality of the photograph. So one of the things about this photograph that makes it so remarkable is partly to do with the fact that it has been subjected to significant improvements and enhancements by one of the leading photographic manipulators of 30 years experience. But at this point, Conan Doyle has the evidence that he needs and that he wants for the article to be published in the Strand magazine. But given the stakes with the debates that he's involved in, these polemics he's involved in, he wants a second front in this war with the Rationalist Press Association. And so via Gardner, he asks for a second set of photographs. So this is 3 years on. By now, Francis is 13 years old, Elsie is 19 years old, engaged to be married, and Conan Doyle, via Gardner, sends them some additional cameras, some nice new, rather fancy cameras, these Cameo quarter plate cameras, and with a set of photographic plates, which they ask to have them take photographs. They say, well, you know, you don't have to take fairy photographs if you don't want to. It's just a gift, a mark of esteem. But by this point, the parents feel that, you know, having had these lavish gifts bestowed on them, they are honor bound to take more photographs. So now the parents are cajoling the girls to take more photographs. Francis in particular at this point is extremely reluctant to do so, but they feel that they don't have an option. And so they produce 3 more photographs. You'll notice the names on the photographs, fairy offering the flower to Iris. So Elsie in the articles was called Iris, and Francis was called Alice. Meanwhile, Conan Doyle wrote to Gardner. He was delighted with the second set of photographs and with his plan to have up his sleeve a second set of photographs. His plan was to publish the first set of photographs and the first article to draw the fire of people like Edward Clodd and the Rationalist Press Association, who would, of course, oppose, ridicule and mock the photographs, only then to produce a second set of photographs in the subsequent article, which Conan Doyle believed would silence them and finally prove his point. And so he writes to Gardner from Australia saying, I feel as if I had prepared a long delay mine, then run away and left you sitting on top of it. I expect I shall hear the boom over here. I hope you won't be incommoded by the explosion. So he knows what he's doing. He knows that he's deliberately setting off a controversy. He wants to exacerbate this conflict with the Rationalist Press Association in order, he thinks, to finally settle the score with the second set of photographs. If Gardner was concerned about the publicity of this explosion going off, it certainly isn't indicated in the way that he went about seeking to maximize the publicity. Remember the photographs of Francis gave her the name of Alice. Gardner wrote to Alice Liddell, the woman who as a child was the subject of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass, inviting her to come and view the fairy photographs just prior to the publication in the Strand magazine. So very much kind of seeking to amplify those connotations and that sort of Wonderland fantasy fairy tale kind of world. When the article came out, Conan Doyle notes that the cry of fake is sure to be raised. but he describes it as an epoch-making event, and he says that a strong prima facie case has been built up. So he presents it here as he's acting objectively. The report has been submitted by Gardner. He's received all this information. He's evaluated them. He's used his detective-like skills on this, and he arrives at the conclusion that, insofar as it's possible to determine one way or the other, there looks to be a strong case that these are genuine photographs and that they've not been faked. In the subsequent article, the tone becomes even stronger. These are not now simply a prima facie case, but we are now in a situation in which actual photographs of fairies are known to exist. And it's no longer that he's evaluating a case that's been put to him, but these are photographs that have strikingly strengthened his case. So Conan Doyle at this point taking increasing ownership of the thing. It did produce a controversy. It did produce uproar and ridicule, as the cartoon that I showed early on illustrated. But Conan Doyle was in no sense cowed by that. This letter to Gardner from June 23rd, that's a freudian slip, 1921, shows Conan Doyle in a ebullient mood. He relishes the conflict. He relishes the prospect of further amplifying the message of promulgating these images further. He talks about a book that they're going to publish, which becomes the Coming of the Fairies, which is published in 1922. He also talks about we should look ahead at this period for if the cinema proposition should have success, we have a thing as marketable as a book. So also commercial considerations creep in here, and this letter is largely concerned with the division of profits. For him, he thinks he deserves 50% because most of the work and the effort of answering endless letters will fall to him. He thinks that Gardner and the girls should split the remaining 50% between them. And he says he thinks that this is a fair settlement. The book does come out in 1922, The Coming of the Fairies. And interestingly, in the book, Conan Doyle speculates on the possibility of fakery, which had obviously been raised, but he dismisses it. He says Elsie could only have done it by cut-out images, which must have been of exquisite beauty, of many different models, fashioned and kept without the knowledge of her parents, and capable of giving the impression of motion when carefully examined by an expert. It was surely impossible, he says. It was surely impossible that a little village with an amateur photographer could have the plant and the skill to turn out a fake which could not be detected by the best experts in London. So, ironically, Conan Doyle describes precisely what actually happened in the book, only to dismiss it and see it as something which was simply impossible. After the fairy photographs were published, Frances Griffiths tried to escape from it. She moved, she married and obviously changed her name, but every so often the story kept on coming back. Sometimes Elsie would kind of willfully fan the flames because she rather enjoyed it, whereas it seems that for Frances Griffiths it rather overshadowed her life and in ways which are quite sad, I think. She certainly didn't enjoy it, and whenever she received attention subsequently, she found it quite painful. The story finally was resolved, or the hoax was finally revealed in 1983. It was a combination of factors. The girls had sworn that they would never reveal the truth as long as Conan Doyle and Edward Gardner were alive, because of the extent to which they'd invested themselves in it. They felt that it would be too awful to put them to that public humiliation, and so they determined that they would keep quiet about it. But in 1983, a combination of some publications by Joe Cooper, which were exposés of what had happened. He'd befriended Frances and Elsie, and had kind of arrived at a conclusion of what had really happened. And he published some articles which really kind of exposed the circumstances. And then Geoffrey Crawley, who was the president of the British Photographic Association, published an article in which he did a forensic analysis of the photographs and revealed that Snelling had been involved in enhancing the pictures, and that the negatives in the Brotherton Library are not in fact the actual negatives from the camera. Nobody knows where those actually are. But he did have this final judgment to make about the significance of the Cottingley Fairies photographs, and of Elsie Wright in particular, with this first photograph of Frances and the fairies. And he said, if you take as a criterion of success coverage in the national media in column inches and television time, quite apart from articles, books, and having a street names to commemorate your efforts, then Elsie is by far the most successful photographer in the craft's history. And yet the girls received almost nothing for the photographs. They got the cameras, they got some gifts, they got some small cash gifts. Elsie got some money towards her marriage from Conan Doyle, but nothing more. Edward Gardner retained the copyright, and all of the subsequent prints that were made, all the ones that are famous that we all know, were made from the enhanced negative that Harold Snelling made and not from the original. So the girls never really benefited from this photograph, or the set of photographs which really dominated their lives, leaving the question, who in the end was truly deceived?
Thank you very much, Merrick. Thank you so much for such an interesting talk covering a lot of what will be in the Cottingley Fairies exhibition that, as we said at the beginning, I hope people will be able to visit soon, and obviously people keep an eye out on the gallery's website and social media. They'll be able to see when that will be available. Just wonder if we have time to answer a few of these questions. They're covering a range of topics. I suppose thinking about your work with the collection that we have here at the university, and you obviously were very familiar with this story from your work on Conan Doyle, and you talked about that kind of being your way into it. When you were actually working with the collections, what did you find any sort of particularly surprising things that you weren't expecting to see?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I found, looking at the glass negatives, it wasn't surprising, but I found it surprising that I was actually allowed to handle them, actually, because I did approach you with this kind of sense of almost kind of reverence, like these are the original kind of things for this this huge hugely significant global hoax, or however you want to think about it. Surprising things, I guess what surprised me mainly was the stuff that came out from the correspondence, and it's the thing I was talking about at the end, really, the way in which the commercial considerations crept in, because Conan Doyle and Gardner started off, particularly Gardner, saying he didn't want to talk about any matters to do with money because he felt it muddied the waters and they were in pursuit of truth. And then there's this sense in which Gardner kind of dined out on it for the rest of his life. People talk about Edward Gardner getting the Cottingley Fairies photographs out for the millionth time, and there is this sort of sense in which he really kind of like went through the rest of his life kind of trading on this, whereas Frances and Elsie didn't really get much from it, but also Frances in particular felt it was almost a curse on her life. So that was not what I was expecting. I thought it was going to be a little bit more fairy tale than that in some respects, and I found that surprising and sad. And I don't think anybody set out deliberately to deceive in that kind of way. I just think it was how it ended up working out.
Yeah. A question from Alison. How important as a context were cultural understandings of girlhood and of the North as sort of unsophisticated in relation to London? That you covered that a bit with your quote from the book about, who could believe that in this village with some amateur photographers that this could be?
Yeah, I think the cultural understanding of girlhood is massively important. Gardner and Doyle exchange letters, particularly around the second set of photographs, where they have this sense that that Elsie, as she's going to get married, that Frances is reaching puberty and she's at an age when she might fall in love, and they say more or less literally that once they've fallen in love, then this sort of fairy gift will leave them. So there is this very clear sort of association with female innocence and the ability to see fairies and this sort of spiritual connection. So I think that's hugely important. But yeah, also the north of England and this idea of Cottingley as this kind of rural backwater where they couldn't possibly be able to take such sophisticated photographs was clearly important as well.
Thank you. We've a few people asking about Doyle's sort of conversion to spiritualism. I wonder if you could say a bit about you obviously talked about that being quite a long time before the fairy photographs were something that he was aware of. Wonder if you could say a bit about what sort of drew him to spiritualism in the first place.
Yeah, sure. He fell out with. He was born into a Catholic family, but he fell out with Catholicism whilst he was at school and organised religion in general. But I think still hankered after the spirituality of. So he was always clearly looking for something. It was when he was living in Southsea. And he joined a philosophical kind of literary society, and he was introduced to the ideas of spiritualism and seances at that point. So that's where his interest began in it. But I think it was really 1917. He claimed it was nothing really to do with the war and the loss of his brother-in-law and his son in the war and the flu pandemic afterwards. I think it's hard to think that didn't have some role to play in it. But he also claimed to have had some sort of impossible revelation from a spirit medium that they couldn't have possibly known. Harry Houdini, who was friends with him at the same time the Cottingley Fairies came out, was forever trying to demonstrate that this is entirely possible through conjuring techniques, but Conan Doyle wouldn't have it. So I think that was, he had some sort of decisive experiences around 1917, but he was introduced to it a long time before.
Thank you. We've time probably just for one last question, and I want to ask, obviously the process of developing an exhibition, there's a big story that you want to tell, and you're not always able to tell everything that you want to. So was there part of the story that you wanted to tell that unfortunately there just simply wasn't room for?
I mean, we talked a bit about, we've managed to include some stuff in terms of Sherlock Holmes in the exhibition. I think, if I'd had a limitless palette to explore, I would have liked to have done a little bit more about Sherlock Holmes, because I think, in so many ways, Sherlock Holmes is the authority figure within all this that makes it possible. He certainly, the reason that it becomes such a big thing is because Conan Doyle is able to amplify these photographs, through his cultural authority, and that stems largely from Sherlock Holmes. So yeah, I would have liked to have been able to do some more on that.
Thank you very much indeed. We're just drawing to a close, so I'll say once again thank you very much to everyone who has submitted questions. I'm sorry that we didn't have time to get to all of them. In fact, we've barely been able to scratch the surface of all the questions that have come in, but great to see so much interest. You'll note in the chat that my colleagues have put some links in where you'll be able to keep up with information about the exhibition, but I will just say finally thank you very much to Merrick, both for your talk this evening, but also all of the work on the exhibition, which we're really looking forward to see.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I can't wait to see it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.